A powerful earthquake just struck beside Italy's supervolcano. The first number they gave us was 11 kilometers deep, catastrophically shallow, disturbingly close to the volcanic system beneath Naples. Then, that number was quietly revised to 373 kilometers. Same earthquake. Completely different story. But here's what that revision does not explain. It does not explain why the ground beneath Pozzuoli has risen nearly 5 feet over 20 years of continuous unrest. It does not explain the 54,000 hidden earthquakes that artificial intelligence just pulled from the seismic archive. And it does not explain why scientists are looking at the current pattern and saying it mirrors the centuries before Campi Flegrei's last eruption. So what actually happened on March 9th, 2026? What does this earthquake mean for the supervolcano? And why are the numbers still not adding up? That is exactly what we are about to find out. Subscribe and follow along, because this volcano is not done. The same system that has been quietly rising for 20 years is still rising. The same pattern that mirrors the centuries before the last eruption is still building. The instruments are still running. The data is still coming in. And when the next piece of this story moves, this channel will break it down to you in plain language before anyone else gets to it. You'll want to be here for that. Now, let us get into it. It is 0003 local time on March 10th, 2026, and something shifts beneath the Tyrrhenian Sea that has no business being there. The seismic networks feel it first. Arrays of ground motion sensors scattered across southern Italy, anchored to bedrock, begin registering an energy pulse propagating outward from a point roughly 10 to 12 kilometers west of the island of Capri. The waveforms spike. Automated systems parse the data. And within minutes, the European Mediterranean Seismological Center, the EMSC, pushes out an alert. Magnitude 5.9 to 6.3, depending on which agency you ask. Epicenter, the Tyrrhenian Sea. Depth, 11 kilometers. Time of origin, 23:03. Coordinated Universal Time on March 9th, 11 kilometers. That number is going to matter. Hold on to it. Across southern Italy, millions of people feel it. Not violently, not the kind of shaking that brings down walls, but enough. That low, rolling sensation in the floor. The chandelier that moves when nothing else is moving. Windows trembling for a few seconds. Then nothing. People in Naples, Salerno, and Campania check their phones. And very quickly, they see what the algorithms are already broadcasting. A magnitude 6 earthquake has just struck beside Italy's supervolcano. The headline writes itself. It travels faster than the seismic wave. The United States Geological Survey, the USGS, runs its pager system, which rapidly estimates casualties and damage from earthquakes anywhere on the planet. It issues a green alert, meaning low expected impact, and on the surface, that should be reassuring. A green alert, low damage, nobody hurt. The kind of seismic event that happens and gets forgotten in a week. But something strange is already happening in the background. The data is changing, not gradually, the way preliminary estimates usually tighten over hours. Something more dramatic is unfolding in the parameter tables, something that almost nobody in the initial wave of social media coverage notices. Because while the world is sharing headlines about a supervolcano earthquake, the scientists processing the raw waveforms are revising a number that changes the entire story. And that number is the depth. What started as an 11-kilometer earthquake, catastrophically shallow, uncomfortably close to the surface, is about to become a 373-kilometer earthquake. And if you think that sounds like it should be less frightening, you haven't yet understood why the difference matters. Earthquake science is not a snapshot. It is a process. In the minutes and hours after a major seismic event, agencies around the world are simultaneously processing the same waveforms through different algorithms, different station networks, different weighting systems. This is not a flaw. It is the nature of doing science in real time with incomplete information. The very first estimate, the one that gets automatically posted and immediately shared, is built on whatever data the nearest stations have transmitted in that first window of time. It is a best guess, and everyone who works in seismology knows it. So when the USGS reports magnitude 6.0, the EMSC reports 6.1, and Italy's own INGV, the Istituto Nazionale di Geofisica e Vulcanologia, settles closer to 5.9, nobody in the scientific community panics. That spread is completely normal. Some rapid automated models briefly estimated as high as 6.3 before more stations weighed in and pulled the number back down. This is routine. Magnitude variations of that size in early reporting are a feature, not a bug. But the depth revision is not routine. 11 kilometers is what the public saw first. 11 kilometers is what sent the Supervolcano earthquake headlines ricocheting across the internet. And 11 kilometers would, in fact, be genuinely alarming, because at that depth, you are talking about a crustal earthquake. You are talking about an event occurring in the same geological layer where volcanoes feed, where fault systems connected to calderas live, where the mechanics of eruption actually operate. An 11-kilometer earthquake near Campi Flegrei would demand serious scrutiny. But the revised depth, converging around 373 kilometers, with some solutions suggesting closer to 414 kilometers, tells an entirely different story. At that depth, you are not in the crust anymore. You are in the mantle. You are inside what geologists call a subducting slab, a section of oceanic tectonic plate that stopped sitting on the surface of the Earth millions of years ago and instead began sinking, pulled by its own density, grinding slowly downward into the interior of the planet. The Mediterranean Sea sits above the African plate, which has been subducting beneath the European plate for tens of millions of years, descending at an angle into the mantle like a slow-motion collision in geological time. Deep focus earthquakes, events occurring below roughly 70 kilometers, are generated not by surface faults, but by stress and phase changes inside these descending slabs. They are, in a very real sense, happening in a completely different part of the Earth than shallow earthquakes. The energy still reaches the surface, but it spreads across a vastly greater volume of rock before it does, which is why deep earthquakes so often cause widespread but relatively mild shaking rather than localized catastrophic destruction. So the scientific interpretation is clear. Scientists overwhelmingly read this as a deep tectonic event inside the African subducting slab. It has nothing structurally to do with the volcanic systems above it. The caldera did not cause this earthquake. The earthquake did not trigger the caldera. The relationship is one of geography, not geology. And yet, and here is the thing that will not let you go, the geography still matters. Because sitting directly above this corner of the Mediterranean, on the surface, a few dozen kilometers away from where the waveforms originated, is one of the most geologically complex and poorly understood volcanic systems on the planet. A place that has been moving, swelling, fracturing, and breathing for 20 years without erupting. And the reason that terrifies people is not the earthquake. The reason is everything that was already happening before the earthquake arrived. The name translates loosely as burning fields. Campi Flegrei sits west of Naples, an irregular depression in the landscape stretching roughly 13 kilometers across. From above, it does not look like a volcano at all, not in the way most people picture one. There is no single cone, no towering peak. Instead, what you see is a collapsed bowl, a caldera, pocked with dozens of vents, craters, fumaroles, and geothermal features spread across a region that includes suburbs, ports, apartment buildings, and beaches. People live on it. People have always lived on it. The Romans built resort villas here. They called the bubbling sulfurous pools the entrance to the underworld. They were not wrong to be dramatic about it. The caldera was born through violence. The first and larger of its two defining eruptions occurred approximately 39,000 years ago, producing an event called the Campanian Ignimbrate, a pyroclastic outpouring so enormous that volcanic ash was deposited across much of Europe and into Central Asia. Layers of that eruption have been found as far away as Russia. Some researchers have proposed that the climatic stress caused by the Campanian Ignimbrite contributed to the decline of Neanderthal populations in Europe, though that hypothesis remains actively debated. What is not debated is the scale. This was one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the European continent. The second major eruption, roughly 15,000 years ago, produced the Neapolitan yellow tuff, the warm golden stone that you will find in the walls of old Naples buildings, quarried from the products of that ancient catastrophe and repurposed into architecture. The city of Naples is literally built from the bones of its own volcano. The last eruption occurred in 1538. It lasted about a week and created a new hill, Monte Nuovo, New Mountain, that rose out of the ground in a matter of days. By the standards of what Campi Flegrei is capable of, it was modest, but it was enough to force the evacuation of the town of Pozzuoli and reshape the coastline. Since then, silence. Almost 5 centuries of relative quiet. But here is where the story changes, because silent is not the same as still. More than 500,000 people currently live inside the boundary of the caldera. That sentence deserves a moment. Not near it, not adjacent to it, inside it. The caldera boundary runs through neighborhoods, through city streets, through areas that most residents know simply as home. The greater Naples metropolitan region contains approximately 3 million people, making Campi Flegrei one of the most densely populated volcanic zones anywhere on Earth. The USGS and volcanological organizations that track global volcanic hazard rank it among the highest risk systems in the world, not because it is the most likely to erupt in absolute terms, but because if it does erupt, the population exposure is unlike almost anywhere else. And the most unsettling part, the part that makes every seismologist who monitors this region look slightly tired when they talk about it, is that the volcano has not been still. It has been waking up, slowly, for the better part of 2 decades. And the thing doing the waking is a phenomenon with a name that sounds almost gentle, but describes something that is anything but. Bradyseism comes from the Greek, brady meaning slow, seism meaning shaking, slow shaking. But that undersells it, because what bradyseism actually describes at Campi Flegrei is the entire ground surface rising and falling like the chest of something breathing. Pressure builds underground, from hydrothermal fluids, from magmatic gases, possibly from magma itself, and the crust above responds. It lifts. Sometimes it sinks. Then it lifts again. The Romans documented it. Medieval fishermen noticed it. Geologists have been measuring it with increasing precision since the 20th century. And what the instruments show right now, in 2026, is that the current phase of uplift is unlike anything recorded in the modern monitoring era. Since the current unrest period began, the ground beneath Pozzuoli, the town that sits closest to the caldera center, the town that has been ground zero for every major bradyseismic episode in recorded history, has risen approximately 148 centimeters. That is roughly 4.8 feet. Nearly 5 feet of ground uplift. Not from an earthquake, not from an eruption, just from pressure building underneath, pushing the crust upward like a slow hydraulic jack operating on geological timescales. Between 2024 and 2025 alone, the ground rose an additional 29 to 30 centimeters. During peak phases of this current unrest cycle, uplift rates have reached 2 centimeters per month. That might sound negligible until you consider that the same process in the 1980s, which prompted a mass evacuation, produced just over 2 meters of total uplift before the system stabilized. The current episode has already exceeded that, accumulated across multiple cycles since the 1950s. Alongside the ground movement, the earthquake record has been climbing. Since 2018, both the frequency of earthquakes inside the caldera and the magnitude of the largest events have been trending upward. The biggest earthquake recorded within Campi Flegrei in recent years struck on June 30th, 2025, at magnitude 4.6. Not catastrophic, but large enough to be felt, large enough to damage buildings in Pozzuoli, and large enough to mark a threshold that scientists had been watching approach for years. The leading explanation for all of this is hydrothermal. Pressurized fluids, hot water, steam, dissolved gases are forcing their way through the fractured rock beneath the caldera, expanding as they heat, pushing the crust upward. This is the majority scientific position. The key distinction, the one that separates manageable concern from genuine alarm, is whether magma itself is involved in the pressure buildup. And that question is still open. Italian Civil Protection currently maintains a yellow alert level for Campi Flegrei. Yellow means elevated monitoring, increased attention, contingency plans being kept current. It does not mean an eruption is expected. It means the system is behaving in ways that require careful watching. It means the instruments are running and the scientists are paying attention. And what those scientists found when they turned artificial intelligence loose on the data should have made far more headlines than the earthquake did. For decades, the standard seismic catalog for Campi Flegrei identified roughly 12,000 earthquakes occurring beneath the caldera across the modern monitoring period. 12,000 earthquakes sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but it turns out it was also a profound undercount. In 2025, a research team applied machine learning detection algorithms to archived seismic records from the region. These algorithms were designed not to replace seismologists, but to do something no human monitoring team could: scan years of continuous raw waveform data, second by second, and identify every event that exceeded a detection threshold far smaller than the conventional cutoff for catalog inclusion. Small earthquakes produce small signals. Small signals get buried in noise. And noise, historically, meant those earthquakes went uncounted. The artificial intelligence found 54,000 earthquakes between 2022 and 2025. 54,000 against the 12,000 that the conventional catalog had captured. That is more than 4 times the detected activity. And the majority of these newly discovered events were microseismic, tiny, imperceptible to anyone standing on the surface, caused by small fractures propagating through rock as fluids moved through cracks and stress fields shifted. Microseismicity is the sound of a system under pressure. It is the crust adjusting, accommodating, fracturing in ways too small to feel, but collectively significant. What this tells scientists is that the rock beneath Campi Flegrei is not simply being pushed upward passively. It is being broken continuously by something that is actively pressurizing the system from below. Every one of those 54,000 events represents a small failure in the crust, a crack that opened, a fracture that propagated, a pathway through which fluid moved that did not exist before. And taken together, they paint a picture of a subsurface environment that is far more dynamic, far more fractured, and far more actively changing than the previous catalog suggested. Think of it this way. If you are applying pressure to a sheet of glass, you do not always see it failing until the moment it breaks. But if you could hear every microscopic crack propagating through the glass, you would know something very different was happening than what the surface appearance suggests. The AI gave scientists the ability to hear those cracks. The discovery also revealed something else that was previously invisible in the noise: patterns, complex fault structures, repeating sequences, spatial clustering that pointed towards specific zones of weakness beneath the caldera. and one of those zones turned out to contain something that no previous survey had fully mapped. In 2025, a collaborative study involving Stanford University, Italy's INGV, and the University of Geneva published results that rewrote the internal structural map of Campi Flegrei. Using the machine learning seismic catalog as a kind of underground imaging tool, the researchers identified a ring fault system encircling the caldera. Ring faults are exactly what they sound like: circular fracture zones that trace the boundary where the roof of a magma chamber collapsed inward during a past eruption. They are one of the defining structural features of caldera formation, and they are significant not just as historical artifacts, but as active pathways, the lines along which future deformation and future eruptions are most likely to follow. Two major fault strands were identified converging directly beneath Pozzuoli, the same Pozzuoli that is experiencing the fastest uplift, the same Pozzuoli that has been at the center of every major bradyseismic crisis in recorded history. This is not a coincidence. The faults are, at minimum, structurally consistent with the zone where underground pressure is concentrating most intensely. The implications are uncomfortable. If the crust above a pressurizing volcanic system is already riddled with ring faults from previous collapse events, it is mechanically weaker than unfractured rock. It can fail at lower pressures. It can transmit stress differently, and it provides pre-existing channels along which magma or hydrothermal fluids could potentially migrate upward more easily than through intact rock. The researchers also found, and this is the nuance that separates responsible alarm from catastrophizing, that there is currently no seismic evidence of magma rising from depths below approximately 3.7 kilometers. The signal that would betray ascending magma, specific patterns of low-frequency tremor, volcanic harmonic tremor, the seismic fingerprint of molten rock forcing itself upward through solid crust, is not prominently present in current data. This is an important constraint. It suggests that what is driving the current uplift is, at least for now, more consistent with hydrothermal processes than with magma intrusion. But the system is weaker than anyone realized. The faults are there, the fractures are multiplying, and history, as it turns out, has seen this particular pattern before. Between 1982 and 1984, Campi Flegrei did something dramatic. The ground beneath Pozzuoli rose more than 2 meters. Earthquakes began occurring in swarms, more than 16,000 over the 2-year period, with the strongest reaching magnitude 4.2. Buildings cracked, streets buckled. The harbor at Pozzuoli, a harbor that had been used continuously since Roman times, was lifted several feet above sea level, leaving fishing boats sitting on newly emerged rock where water had been the season before. The Italian government made a decision. They evacuated approximately 40,000 residents from the most exposed areas of Pozzuoli. 40,000 people moved from their homes because the ground beneath those homes was no longer considered stable. It was one of the largest precautionary volcanic evacuations in European history. And then nothing happened. The swarms slowed. The uplift stopped. The ground stabilized. Over the following years, it actually sank slightly, subsiding as pressure dissipated. No eruption occurred. The tens of thousands of people who had left their homes eventually returned. Pozzuoli was rebuilt, reinforced, repopulated. Scientists spent years trying to understand why the system had calmed so suddenly after behaving so dramatically. The honest answer is that they are still not fully certain. The leading theories involve fluid pressure escaping through fracture networks that opened during the crisis, essentially giving the system a pressure release valve that prevented conditions from escalating further. Another possibility is that whatever magmatic process had been feeding heat and pressure into the hydrothermal system simply paused or redirected. Volcanic systems do not always behave according to the logic we would prefer. They have their own timelines, but here's the thing about the 1980s crisis that matters for understanding today. What ended that crisis was not fundamentally understood. which means what is driving the current episode, which has in many ways surpassed the 1980s in both uplift and seismic complexity, may or may not follow the same trajectory. The precedent is not reassuring in the way you would hope. It is reassuring in the way that says it resolved before, but offers no guarantee about why or whether it will again. And recently, researchers found an older pattern that looks uncomfortably familiar. In 2025, a study published in the journal Natural Hazards and Earth System Sciences attempted something difficult: reconstructing the sequence of geological events that preceded Campi Flegrei's last eruption in 1538. The researchers combed through historical records, chronicles, correspondence, accounts from travelers and clergy and local administrators for references to earthquakes, ground deformation, changes in the coastline, changes in thermal activity, anything that could be translated into a proxy record of volcanic unrest across the centuries before Monte Nuovo appeared. This kind of paleoseismological detective work is painstaking and imprecise, but it produces something valuable: a timeline. What they found for the period between approximately 1430 and 1503 was a pattern of increasing seismic activity and ground unrest. The frequency of documented events climbed. The severity of described ground changes escalated. And this escalating phase preceded the eventual eruption by decades, not days. Then they compared that medieval unrest pattern to the modern instrumental record spanning 1950 to 2024. The similarities were notable. Both periods show a long-term trend of increasing seismic frequency. Both show episodic uplift punctuated by partial subsidence. Both suggest a system gradually accumulating stress and pressure over decadal timescales, punctuated by crises that resolve temporarily before resuming. But there is a crucial difference, and responsible science demands that it be stated clearly. The period leading to the 1538 eruption produced roughly 10 meters of cumulative ground uplift across its full unrest phase. The modern monitoring era has recorded approximately 4.3 meters of total uplift across all bradyseismic cycles since the mid-20th century. If the analogy holds, the system today may be earlier in its deformation process, not approaching the same threshold. Not yet. The historical comparison is scientifically interesting. It is not proof that an eruption is imminent. Multiple unrest phases have ended without eruptions at Campi Flegrei, including the 1980s crisis we just discussed. The system is capable of escalating and then quieting. It has done so repeatedly. What no model can currently tell you is whether the current episode is one of those that resolves, or whether it is building towards something that does not. Which brings us back to the earthquake that started this story, and the question that the numbers are still, even now, refusing to answer cleanly. Let us be precise, because precision matters here more than drama. The March 9th, 2026 earthquake, as understood by the current scientific consensus, was a deep-focus tectonic event. It occurred inside the subducting African slab at approximately 373 kilometers depth, generated by internal stress within the descending plate, and its relationship to Campi Flegrei is one of coincidence in geography rather than causation in geology. The earthquake did not rupture a fault connected to the caldera. It did not send a pressure pulse into the hydrothermal system. It did not crack the ring faults that the 2025 study mapped. The INGV, Italy's own National Volcanology Institute, the agency with the most instruments in the ground and the most direct monitoring of the caldera, reported no significant changes in volcanic parameters in the immediate aftermath of the event. That is the scientific statement. That is the responsible summary. And yet the question does not fully close, because seismology at the scale of complex volcanic systems is not a subject that offers clean closures. Deep earthquakes, particularly those occurring in the magnitude 6 range, transmit dynamic stress through the crust above them. That stress is diffuse, spread across hundreds of kilometers of mantle and rock by the time it reaches the surface. The amplitudes involved are small. The probability that a stress perturbation of this magnitude at this depth would change conditions meaningfully inside a hydrothermal system 300 and more kilometers above is considered low by most researchers who model such interactions. Low, but not studied as exhaustively as we might like, because deep earthquake to shallow volcanic system interactions are genuinely difficult to characterize. The datasets are limited. The models are imperfect. What we also know from decades of research on volcanic systems globally is that Campi Flegrei exists in a state of heightened sensitivity. The ground is already fractured. The pressures are already elevated. The system is already operating closer to whatever threshold governs its behavior than it was 20 years ago. In systems under stress, even small perturbations can occasionally produce disproportionate responses. This is not a prediction. It is a physical principle. The earthquake did not cause a crisis. The monitoring data supports that conclusion. But it arrived in a place and at a time when the baseline was already not normal, and that context is not nothing. A nitty-gritty. The 11-kilometer depth is worth lingering on for a moment, not because it turned out to be correct, it did not, but because of what its brief existence in the public record reveals about how information moves in the modern world. When the EMSC posted its initial alert, it included the preliminary depth of 11 kilometers. That number was accurate as a first-pass estimate based on the waveforms available in the first few minutes. But it was a preliminary estimate, labeled as such in the scientific record, subject to revision, understood by every seismologist reading it to be a starting point rather than a conclusion. This is standard practice. It is how rapid reporting works. But the headline writers and social media algorithms do not wait for the revision. They took the 11-kilometer figure, combined it with the proximity to Campi Flegrei, and generated a narrative that spread across multiple continents before the depth had been corrected. Shallow earthquake strikes near Supervolcano. Within hours, that framing had reached millions of people. Within days, it had spawned analysis videos, news articles, and comment sections full of people asking whether Campi Flegrei was about to erupt. When the USGS and other agencies updated their solutions to approximately 373 kilometers, those corrections circulated in a much smaller radius among a much more technically engaged audience. The correction rarely makes it back to the people who shared the original alarm. This is not unique to this earthquake. It is a structural feature of how science and social media interact, and it creates a persistent gap between public understanding and current knowledge that is genuinely difficult to close. The irony, of course, is that the actual situation at Campi Flegrei, the one that does not depend on a misreported earthquake depth to be interesting, is alarming enough on its own terms. You do not need a shallow crustal earthquake to justify paying attention to this caldera. The 54,000 hidden earthquakes, the nearly 5 feet of ground uplift, the ring fault system, the medieval analog, the 500,000 people living inside the boundary. All of that was true before March 9th, 2026, and all of it remains true regardless of what the depth turns out to be. The earthquake was a trigger for attention. The attention, for once, was not misplaced, just slightly misdirected. To understand what is actually driving the current unrest at Campi Flegrei, you have to go underground, past the foundations of the apartment blocks and the Roman ruins, past the water table and the aquifer layers, down into the zone where the rock is no longer cool and dark but hot, fractured and saturated with mineral-laden fluid under extraordinary pressure. The hydrothermal system at Campi Flegrei is fed from below by heat, and that heat comes, ultimately, from magma. Somewhere beneath the caldera, estimates from geophysical surveys suggest a depth of somewhere between 3 and 8 kilometers. Depending on the model, there is a body of partially molten rock, or a zone of crystal mush, or some combination of both, that has been sitting there for a very long time, slowly releasing heat into the rock and fluids above it. That heat drives a hydrothermal circulation system that is, in some ways, more dynamic and more immediately responsive to pressure changes than the magma itself. When heat inputs increase from magma moving slightly upward, from additional degassing, from any number of deep processes that are difficult to observe directly, the hydrothermal fluids expand. They convert to steam in shallow zones. They dissolve more rock. They increase pore pressure in the fractures they occupy. And when pore pressure in fractured rock increases, two things happen. The rock deforms. It pushes upward, producing the ground uplift that the GPS stations record. And it breaks. It fractures in small earthquakes, the microseismic events that the AI system cataloged. This is the mechanism behind bradyseism. This is what is lifting Pozzuoli. And the key question, the one that determines whether the current episode remains a manageable hydrothermal event or becomes something more serious, is whether the heat source itself is changing, whether the magma body is moving upward, whether what is currently a hydrothermal crisis could transition into a magmatic intrusion. The current monitoring data does not show strong evidence of that transition. Volcanic gas ratios, specifically the ratio of carbon dioxide to sulfur dioxide in fumarole emissions, have been shifting in ways that some researchers find consistent with increasing magmatic influence, but the interpretation is actively debated. Seismic tomography studies have attempted to image the subsurface directly, and the results suggest the presence of partial melt at depth. But this is not new. The partial melt was always there. The question is whether it is moving. The honest answer, the one that keeps volcanologists awake, is that the instruments can tell you what is happening right now, at the surface and in the shallow crust, with reasonable confidence. What is happening 4 or 5 or 8 kilometers down, in the zone where the magmatic system actually lives? That is where the uncertainty is deepest, and where the consequences of being wrong are most severe. One of the more sobering findings from recent research into Campi Flegrei concerns not just the amount of deformation the caldera has experienced, but the permanent nature of that deformation. Geologists make a distinction between elastic and inelastic deformation. Elastic deformation is like squeezing a rubber ball. The material deforms under pressure, but when the pressure is removed, it springs back to its original shape. Inelastic deformation, or plastic deformation, is what happens when the material does not fully recover. It has been permanently reshaped. The bonds have broken. The structure has changed in ways that cannot be undone simply by removing the pressure that caused them. Research published in recent years suggests that portions of the crust beneath Campi Flegrei are undergoing inelastic deformation. The repeated cycles of inflation and deflation, lifting and sinking, are not simply flexing the crust and returning it to a resting state. They are accumulating permanent strain. Each cycle leaves the rock slightly weaker than it was before, slightly more fractured, slightly more vulnerable to the next pressure increment. The threshold at which the system could produce a larger magnitude earthquake, or at which a fracture network could propagate from depth to surface, decreases incrementally with each cycle. Think of it as bending a paperclip. The first bend is easy, and if you bend it back, it almost returns to straight. The second bend leaves a visible crease. By the third and fourth bends, the metal is visibly fatigued. It bends more easily, and eventually, it does not spring back at all. The crust beneath Pozzuoli is not a paperclip, and the analogy has its limits. But the underlying physical principle, that repeated stress cycles can progressively degrade material properties, is well established in rock mechanics. What this means in practical terms is that the caldera's behavior going forward may not look like its behavior in the past. The 1980s crisis ended when the system stabilized, but the system that would need to stabilize today is not identical to the system that stabilized in 1984. It has been through additional cycles. It is more fractured. It has a ring fault system that has now been mapped and confirmed. The playbook from previous crises is a guide, not a guarantee. Italy has a plan for Campi Flegrei. It is called the National Emergency Plan for Volcanic Crises in the Campania region, and it has been updated multiple times over the past 2 decades in response to the ongoing unrest. Italian Civil Protection runs evacuation drills. The alert system has multiple levels: green, yellow, orange, red, with progressively escalating response protocols attached to each. At red alert, the plan calls for the evacuation of the approximately 500,000 people living inside the caldera boundary. 500,000 people. In a region where the road network was designed for a fraction of that population. In an area where a volcanic emergency could occur with warning measured in hours to days rather than months, depending on the nature of the unrest. The logistics are genuinely daunting. Transportation modeling for the Naples region under emergency conditions suggests that full evacuation of the caldera zone would take a minimum of 72 hours under favorable conditions, and considerably longer under realistic conditions that include panic, infrastructure damage from pre-eruptive earthquakes, and the simple physics of moving hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously through a limited number of exit corridors. The plan also has to account for the broader Naples metropolitan population of approximately 3 million, many of whom would likely attempt to leave regardless of whether official evacuation orders applied to their specific zone. The psychological reality of living next to a supervolcano in elevated unrest is that when the alert level rises, people do not calmly consult the official guidance and move in orderly sequence. They move when they feel afraid, and fear does not respect zone boundaries. Italian authorities are not unaware of these challenges. Emergency planners have been refining the logistics for years. Pre-designated evacuation routes, reception areas in other regions, coordination with national railways and military transport. These systems have been developed and tested. The question of how well they would function under actual emergency conditions is one that nobody wants to answer empirically. There is also the question of communication. One of the lessons from volcanic emergencies globally is that public trust in official information is critical to orderly evacuation, and public trust erodes quickly when preliminary data is revised dramatically, when headlines say one thing and official bulletins say another, when the story that reached you on social media at midnight contradicts the press release that came out at noon the next day. The 11-kilometer to 373-kilometer revision for the March 9th earthquake was, in scientific terms, entirely routine. In public communication terms, it was the kind of thing that makes people stop trusting the numbers. After everything, the AI-detected earthquakes, the ring fault mapping, the medieval comparison, the ground uplift, the depth revision, the hydrothermal models. What we are left with is not a catastrophe prediction. What we are left with is a genuinely open question, being asked by some of the most capable volcanologists on the planet, with the best available instruments and models in real time. And open questions, when they concern a supervolcano sitting beneath 3 million people, deserve more than a headline and a revision. Is Campi Flegrei approaching an eruption? The honest answer is, we do not know, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either being careless with uncertainty or has access to information that is not publicly available. I want to sit with that answer for a moment, because it is not a satisfying one, and I think the discomfort of it is actually important. We live in an information environment that rewards certainty. Algorithms amplify the definitive claim. The confident prediction travels further than the careful hedge. And so when scientists who have spent their careers studying this caldera say genuinely that they cannot tell you what comes next, it tends to get either repackaged as false alarm or inflated into imminent catastrophe, depending on which direction the wind is blowing that week. Neither translation is honest. Neither serves the people living inside the caldera boundary. What the data supports is this: The system is more active than it has been at any point in the modern monitoring era. Not marginally more active, significantly more active, in ways that the conventional catalog had been systematically undercounting until artificial intelligence corrected the record. The crust is weaker and more fractured than any previous survey revealed, with a ring fault system now confirmed beneath the most deformed part of the caldera. The ground has risen nearly 5 feet and shows no sign of stopping, accumulating uplift across multiple bradyseismic cycles in a trend that has been moving in one direction for 2 decades. The seismicity, when properly counted, is 4 times what the standard catalog suggested. 54,000 events against 12,000. A correction so large it fundamentally changes the picture of how dynamic this system actually is. The historical analogy from the medieval period is imperfect, as all historical analogies are, but it is not dismissible, because the researchers who made the comparison are serious scientists publishing in peer-reviewed journals, not fringe voices looking for attention. And the population exposure, if any of these trends cross whatever unknown threshold separates prolonged unrest from eruption, is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. The combination of geological risk and human density at Campi Flegrei is, by most measures, without parallel among active volcanic systems globally. Those are the things the data supports. They are worth saying clearly, because they tend to get lost when the conversation moves to reassurance. What the data does not support is imminent eruption. There is currently no seismic evidence of magma ascending from below approximately 3.7 kilometers. That is a meaningful constraint. Magma moving upward through the crust leaves a signature, specific patterns of low-frequency seismic tremor, harmonic signals, the kind of ground motion that is distinct from hydrothermal activity and recognizable to anyone running a modern monitoring network. Those signatures are not prominently present in the current data stream. The inflation rate, while elevated compared to historical baselines, has not shown the kind of rapid, non-linear acceleration that typically precedes volcanic crises in the hours and days before eruption. There is no sharp uptick in the rate of change. The system is moving, but it is not lurching. The Italian monitoring network is extensive, well-funded, staffed by scientists who have been watching this specific system for their entire careers, and integrated with European and global monitoring infrastructure. If the parameters that indicate escalating danger begin moving in the direction that matters, those people will see it. That is not blind faith in institutions. That is a reasonable assessment of a genuinely capable scientific operation. But here's the thing about volcanic systems that no amount of monitoring infrastructure fully resolves. They are not simple. They do not send clear, unambiguous signals on a predictable timeline before they act. The history of volcanology is, in part, a history of surprises, systems that escalated faster than models predicted, precursor sequences that looked textbook until they did not, and eruptions that arrived at the end of long quiet periods that gave no obvious warning of their ending. The uncertainty in the forecast for Campi Flegrei is not a failure of science. It is not a gap that better instruments will fully close, though better instruments help. It is an honest representation of how complex, how non-linear, and how incompletely understood these systems fundamentally are. Volcanoes operate on timescales and through processes that do not map neatly onto the monitoring windows we have available. The Earth does not file a flight plan. It does not issue a departure notice. It moves when the conditions are right, according to rules that are only partially written in the literature we have. The March 9th earthquake was, in all probability, a deep tectonic event that had nothing to do with the volcanic unrest above it. The initial depth of 11 kilometers was a preliminary estimate that did not survive contact with the full data set, revised to 373 kilometers as additional station data was incorporated and the waveform solutions converged. The scientific consensus on both points is clear and consistent. The earthquake should not be the reason you are paying attention to Campi Flegrei, because the earthquake was almost certainly coincidental to the story of the caldera, a deep slab event that happened to occur beneath a piece of ocean floor that also happens to sit near one of the most watched volcanoes on the planet. But here's the sentence that I keep coming back to, the one that I think deserves to end this. The earthquake was probably coincidental. The unrest was not. The 54,000 earthquakes were not. The 5 feet of ground uplift were not. The ring faults were not. The medieval comparison was not. None of those things exist because of the March 9th event, and none of them go away because the depth was revised. They were there before the earthquake arrived. They were there while the world briefly paid attention, and they are there now that the world has moved on to the next headline. And yet, the caldera is moving, the ground is rising, the fractures are multiplying. The history of this place is written in eruptions so large, they left their ash in the sediment layers of dozens of countries and in the chemistry of ancient ice cores drilled from glaciers thousands of kilometers away. The Campanian ignimbrite, the eruption that defined this caldera 39,000 years ago, was an event of a scale that most people cannot picture. Not a mountain exploding, not a lava flow reaching a town. A release of energy so vast that it altered atmospheric chemistry across a continent, buried landscapes under meters of superheated material, and may have intersected with the decline of an entire human species. That is the system we are talking about. That is the history written in the rock beneath the apartment blocks, and the harbor, and the streets where 500,000 people are currently going about their lives. The earthquake came and went. The question it briefly forced everyone to ask is the same question that was sitting there before it arrived, and will be sitting there long after the coverage moves on to something else. What happens when the burning fields finally burn again? What does the evacuation of 500,000 people look like when the roads were not built for it? What does warning time look like when the precursor sequence does not follow the expected pattern? What does the rest of Europe look like downwind of a system that, at its largest, has reached across an entire continent? We do not know. And I mean that in the fullest sense. Not as a rhetorical gesture toward humility, but as a genuine statement of the current state of the science. The researchers watching this system are among the best in the world at what they do, and they do not know. The instruments running 24 hours a day beneath the streets of Pozzuoli are the most sophisticated ever deployed on this caldera, and they do not yet know. Somewhere beneath those streets, in the fractured rock 3 kilometers down, in the hydrothermal fluids moving through faults that a machine had to find because human monitoring missed them, in the slow creep of ground that has been rising since before most of the people living above it were born. Somewhere in all of that, the answer is already being written. We just do not have the instrument to read it yet.